Thank you, Dennis. So let's get going. Okay, so sit down comfortably and we'll get started with the meditation straight away. Okay, so as always, just start out by relaxing, just feeling the body, and as you close your eyes, the world of the body comes into focus, and you can feel what is going on. So just start off by allowing the world to fade away, allowing all the coronaviruses to fade away from your mind, and come to a sense of peace, and letting go of all that fear and anxiety that arises when we have these kind of problems in the world. And just allow the burdens of the world to fall away and drop away. And as you do so, you start to find this wonderful refuge inside, where all the problems of the world, and there's quite a few at the moment, they don't really matter anymore. It's as if there is a safe space inside, a refuge, the real home inside. So move towards that real home, and when you build up that refuge inside, the worldly problems don't really matter so much anymore. And if you find yourself thinking about the worldly things, the problems of the world, and remind yourself that there is no solution in that realm. Just one problem after another. There's no end. There's no satisfaction to be found in that area. There's only one place there is satisfaction to be found, and that is in the spiritual path, in particular in meditation practice. So just leave all the rubbish alone. Leave all the discontent and all those things that have no solution. Leave them to one side. because there's nothing there to really be found of any real value. And as everything calms down, make sure you feel that beautiful sense of peace that arises inside her. And the more you delight in that feeling of emptiness, the more you incline towards meditation practice. What a wonderful thing it is to be free of all those worldly things, just to leave them to one side, and just experience the sense of emptiness instead. This is a very useful perception to bring up. we're now coming close to the end of the meditation, and as usual I recommend you just to review very briefly what you have done over the last half an hour and so. And if you feel a bit more peaceful, a bit better as a consequence, then ask yourself why that is the case. Try to understand the process of meditation practice. Okay.